Imagine your child is seriously struggling in school, like really falling behind. And the government tells you, hey, we can give them the extra support they need, but by law, you have to get a formal medical diagnosis first.
Right, which sounds reasonable on paper.
Exactly, on paper. So you say, okay, great, where's the doctor? And the government looks at you and says, oh, we don't actually have any, so what do?
You're completely stuck.
You are. And welcome to the deep dive. I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right out of the gate today, because we are taking on a mission that touches exactly that kind of scenario.
Yeah, and we should clarify, today's deep dive isn't really a medical discussion.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to debate, what ADHD is or the clinical criteria or the neuroscience behind it. We are undertaking a forensic look at a colossal system-wide failure here in the UK.
A total breakdown. We're stepping completely out of the clinical realm to examine the machinery of the healthcare and education systems themselves. Because when you look under the hood, the machinery is actively buckling. It's buckling under the weight of its own contradictory rules.
Actively breaking down completely in some areas, yeah.
So to figure out how this actually happened, we are pulling from a massive stack of recent intelligence. We've got the devastating 2024 DARTSI review,
which was a massive wake-up call.
Huge. And we're also looking at the January 2026 market failure report from the CHPI, that's the Center for Health and Public Interest. Plus, we've got late 2025 data sets from the Department for Work and Pensions and the Department for Education.
Right. And finally, we are diving into the explosive February 2026 NHS digital figures.
Okay, let's unpack this, because trying to comprehend how a system fails on this scale, it really requires looking at the mechanics. You often hear crises compared to like slow motion train crash.
Yeah, where everyone has the timetable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But reading these sources, it feels more like watching a massive dam about to break. I mean, the water level, the patient demand has been visibly rising for years. The main spillway is completely blocked. But instead of releasing the pressure, the system just kept legally mandating that the water has to keep flowing.
That structural view is vital here, because when you confront the sheer scale of this multi-billion-pound crisis, the immediate reaction is just shock at the numbers.
Oh, the numbers are wild.
They are. But what's fascinating here is that the most disturbing element isn't the scale itself, it is the absolute predictability of it all.
Right.
This was not some sudden pandemic-style ambush. It was a documented, heavily tracked trajectory that was basically just allowed to run its course.
Allowed to just happen. Yeah. Let's lay out what that course looks like right now so you, the listener, can understand the reality on the ground as of early 2026. Because you might be thinking, well, I don't have ADHD. Why is this my problem?
It affects everyone, ultimately.
Exactly. We are going to show you exactly how this is draining your local resources. So what do the latest numbers actually tell us?
Well, the February 2026 NHS digital data gives us a very stark picture of this bottleneck. In December 2025 alone, there were 18,915 new referrals for ADHD assessments.
Wait, almost 19,000 in a single month?
Yes. That represents a 17.3% jump year over year for just one single month. And when you zoom out, we are looking at up to 735,157 people in England sitting with open referrals that might relate to ADHD.
Over 700,000 people in a holding pattern.
But
that is, what does that actually mean in terms of time? Because I saw in the DARTSI review that depending on your postcode, the wait time is just completely disconnected from reality.
Oh, it has moved way beyond standard healthcare delays. In some regions, wait times for an assessment are stretching up to a decade.
A decade?
Yeah.
Just stop and think about the mechanics of that. If your 7-year-old child gets referred today because they are failing in primary school, a 10-year wait means they are practically finishing high school before a doctor even looks at their file.
The formative years of their education are just entirely gone.
Gone.
Which brings us to the financial mechanics of trying to manage a backlog that size. The NHS is structured around local regional wallets, basically, called Integrated Care Boards, or ICBs.
Right, the local funding hubs.
Exactly. If we look at just 32 of those ICBs, their projected spending on ADHD services for 2025-26 is slated to hit £314 million.
314 million. And what were they actually budgeted to spend?
150 million.
So they're operating with a 164 million pound overspend.
Right. A massive hole in the budget.
And here is where it connects back to you, the listener. An integrated care board has a finite amount of money. If they are legally forced to cover a 164 million pound black hole in assessment costs, That money does not just materialize out of thin air.
It has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. It gets pulled from your local A&E. It gets diverted from the oncology ward or, delayed knee replacements. The entire local healthcare ecosystem takes the hit.
And the financial drain doesn't stop at the hospital doors either. It bleeds directly into welfare and local governance. The Department for Work and Pensions data from late 2025 shows that disability benefits, specifically the personal independence payment, or PIP linked to ADHD, they tripled in real terms between 2021 and 2024-25. Tripled, reaching 577 million pounds.
Wow.
And in the education sector, January 2025 data shows over 638,000 active education, health, and care plans.
Those are the EHCPs, right?
Yeah.
The legal documents that mandate extra funding for a student.
Yes, exactly. And that number is an 11% increase in just 1 year.
And local councils are the ones on the hook to fund the support outlined in those EHCPs, right?
There you are.
Which explains the February 2026 Local Government Association survey. I mean, they issued a warning that 8 in 10 councils are now facing insolvency. That is literal municipal bankruptcy, driven in large part by the legal obligation to fund these high-needs deficits.
It's staggering.
So if you are wondering why your council tax keeps going up while your local library closes and the potholes don't get fixed, this is a massive piece of that puzzle. But wait, I have to ask the obvious question here. How do you blow a 164 million pound hole in local health budgets, triple disability payouts to £500 million, and push 80% of local councils to the brink of bankruptcy without anyone in government pulling the fire alarm?
Well, the terrifying truth is that the fire alarm was pulled. It was hardwired into the system and ringing loudly on public dashboards for nearly a decade.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the 2024 Darcy Review was treated by the press as this, watershed moment, like someone had finally cracked open a secret vault of data.
Right, but that's not what happened at all.
Exactly. Reading the sources, Darcy didn't uncover anything hidden. The review just formalized routine administrative data that was already sitting in plain sight on gov.uk.
The data trail is remarkably unbroken. If we go back to the late 2010s, just using the 2016 to 2019 baseline NHS digital and prescribing data, we're already mapping aggressive year-on-year growth.
So before the pandemic even hit.
Long before. The Darcy investigation explicitly noted that from 2016 onward, children's waiting lists for ADHD assessments were growing at 65% per year. The adult lists were growing at 77% per year.
Compounding annually.
Yeah.
That's absurd.
Precisely. And then the pandemic acted as this unique societal stress test. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the DWP statistics recorded a severe spike in PIP claims for hyperkinetic disorders, which is the clinical category capturing ADHD.
Right, because suddenly everyone's routines are destroyed.
Yes. The shift to remote work and remote schooling stripped away a lot of the environmental scaffolding people relied on to manage their lives. Suddenly, symptoms that were previously masked became impossible to ignore.
So the baseline was already compounding at 70+%. And then the pandemic just rips away everyone's coping mechanisms.
Exactly. And this is the critical juncture where the financial markets took notice. Private equity firms began acquiring independent ADHD clinics as early as 2021.
Wow. In 2021.
Yeah. And they weren't operating on insider information. They were looking at the exact same public indicators we are discussing right now. They saw the public sector failing to meet demand and recognized a massive long-term investment opportunity.
Okay, so the smart money read the public dashboard and placed their bets. And then we hit the cliff face in 2022 through 2025. Post-pandemic prescription volumes for ADHD medication jumped nearly 18% annually.
The compounding effect by October 2025 was staggering. PIP claims for these disorders jumped another 20% in one single year, going from roughly 75,000 to over 91,000.
In 1 year.
In 1 year. And Darcy highlighted a truly incredible metric. Medication prescribing had been rising by about 10% annually for nearly 2 decades.
2 decades. Go back to our dam metaphor. The system operators were literally watching the water rise 10% every single year for 20 years. They saw the 77% list growth. Why on earth did the system just stare at its own dashboard and do nothing?
Because the system's own rules forbade it from opening the relief valves. It wasn't a failure to look at the data. It was an inability to overcome the structural drivers that the government itself had built into the system.
Structural drivers.
Okay.
Let's dig into the mechanics of this. Why did patient demand so drastically outstrip the state's ability to supply care?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the expansion was powered by 3 interlocking engines. The first engine is the most straightforward. It's a physical collapse in NHS capacity.
They just didn't have the staff.
Exactly. We had long-standing psychiatric workforce shortages. Psychiatry has historically been underfunded compared to acute medicine. So when the post-pandemic surge in mental health referrals hit, the NHS simply did not have the doctors in the buildings to conduct the assessments.
Right. If you don't have doctors, the waiting lists grow. But those patients don't just disappear. Which leads us to the second engine, which is the policy and funding incentives. And this is where the bureaucracy actually forces the crisis to multiply.
It really does.
In England, there is a legal framework called the Right to Choose scheme. Can you explain how that actually works in practice?
Yeah, so the Right to Choose scheme mandates that if an NHS patient is facing an unduly long wait for a mental health assessment, they have the legal right to choose an independent private provider instead. And the crucial mechanism here is that the NHS is legally required to fit the bill for that private assessment.
So the state says, hey, we're too slow. Go find a private business and we will pay them whatever their rate is.
Yes.
But why are so many people desperate for that assessment in the first place? I mean, it's not just for peace of mind, is it? It's tied to those disability benefits and educational plans we talked about earlier.
That is the core of the second engine. The SEND framework, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, and the PIP welfare framework are highly, highly rigid. To unlock essential funding for, say, a teaching assistant in a classroom, or to receive financial disability support as an adult, the bureaucratic gatekeepers require a formal, recognized medical diagnosis.
See, this is a paradoxical doom loop. The government creates a policy demanding a formal medical diagnosis before a struggling child can get basic help in a public school. But the government's own health service hasn't hired enough psychiatrists to provide that diagnosis.
It's totally contradictory.
Aren't we basically forcing desperate parents and patients into the private market? I mean, you are legally mandated to get a piece of paper that the state cannot give you.
Exactly. It creates a scenario of infinite, legally mandated demand colliding with zero public supply. And when you create a vacuum of that magnitude, the market will inevitably step in to fill the void, especially when you factor in the third engine, which is cultural acceleration.
You're talking about the explosion of awareness on social media, like everyone talking about it online.
Right. Widespread discourse on platforms like TikTok, celebrity disclosures, and a cultural shift towards self-identification completely shattered the historical stigma surrounding neurodivergence. People who had struggled silently for decades finally had a vocabulary for their experience.
And taking away that stigma is objectively a good thing.
Oh, absolutely.
But the physical infrastructure of the NHS was built for an era when nobody talked about this. So you have a culturally awakened public, a legal requirement to get a diagnosis to access your basic civil welfare rights, an NHS with no doctors, and a law that says the NHS will pay private companies to do the job.
It's the perfect storm.
That isn't just a vacuum. That is a state-funded commercial gold rush.
And the financial shift was immediate and massive. Between 2020 and 2023, NHS expenditure on independent ADHD providers rose by an astonishing 252%.
252% in 36 months. And where does all that public money go? The January 2026 CHPI market failure report really lifts the lid on this because we aren't talking about local neighborhood doctors picking up the slack. We are talking about corporate consolidation.
Heavy consolidation. The CHPI report documented the corporatization of the entire diagnostic pathway. They found incredibly high profit margins. One provider was operating with margins up to 33%.
33% on state funds.
Yeah. That level of profitability in a state-funded service is highly unusual and immediately attracts private equity.
And the sources outline some very specific acquisitions that show how aggressive this got. In May 2025, ADHD 360, which is one of the biggest players in the space, was sold to Keys Group. And back in October 2023, a company called Psychon Ltd. was acquired by One Bright, which is backed by the massive private equity firm EMK Capital.
Right, these are major investments.
Yeah, they were buying up the diagnostic infrastructure because the government had essentially guaranteed a never-ending customer base, completely paid for by the taxpayer.
And when private equity models are applied to healthcare, the mechanism for generating a 33% profit margin usually involves maximizing volume and minimizing overhead. And as this private provision expanded at breakneck speed, the structural flaws began to severely impact patient safety.
Quality goes out the window when you incentivize volume. And this wasn't just a theoretical worry, it became very public. The BBC Panorama undercover investigation back in May 2023 exposed the reality inside some of these clinics.
Where the findings were really concerning.
We are talking about incredibly short appointment times, barely scratching the surface of a patient's medical history, leading to suspiciously high diagnosis rates.
And the CHPI report corroborated those concerns at a systemic level. They noted that the rapid expansion just completely outpaced regulatory oversight. Some of these high-volume providers were operating without full registration from the Care Quality Commission, the CQC.
Wait, operating without full registration?
Yes. And others had incredibly loose contractual oversight from the NHS itself, meaning the state was paying millions without auditing the clinical rigor of the assessments.
I even read in the sources that some clinics offer buy now, pay later plans through consumer credit services. Think about the mechanism there. How does a healthcare diagnostic clinic function like a transaction on a fast fashion website?
It's a very different model of care.
It genuinely sounds less like healthcare and more like a Wild West transaction processing center. Is this system even managing health anymore, or is it just churning out expensive pieces of paper to satisfy the school board's bureaucracy?
Well, this raises an important question about value for public money and, honestly, the ultimate human cost, because the variation in diagnostic quality is immense. If some clinics are pushing patients through a 45-minute Zoom call and diagnosing almost everyone who pays the fee, you flood the downstream system.
Right.
Genuine cases, people with severe, complex, and debilitating needs, are now forced into the exact same bottleneck, competing for severely limited capacity and resources.
And they're not just competing for an appointment. The actual medication is running out.
Because the mechanism of the supply chain cannot handle the diagnostic explosion. ADHD medications are heavily regulated, controlled substances. Global pharmaceutical manufacturers have strict, legally binding quotas set years in advance.
They can't just make more.
No, they physically cannot just flip a switch and produce 200% more medication overnight, simply because independent clinics in the UK suddenly diagnose tens of thousands of new people.
So the global quota hits a wall and the supply just dries up. This is where the data dump turns into a human tragedy. We spend so much time talking about 164 million pound overspends and 33% profit margins, and it is so easy to lose sight of the person at the center of this wreckage.
The real people impacted, yes.
Think about an unsupported child who can't get an EHCP for their school because they are stuck on a 7-year NHS waiting list. Or think about an adult whose life is falling apart, who scrapes together the money for a buy now, pay later private assessment, finally gets the diagnosis, only to walk into a pharmacy and find out the medication they desperately need to function is globally out of stock. The system expanded its bureaucracy to capture the demand, but it completely lost the ability to provide consistent, high-quality care.
It is the ultimate failure of public policy planning. The system operators built the roadmap. They watched the data travel exactly along the predicted path since 2016, and they just refused to alter the fundamental rules of the road.
So what does this all mean? The stakes here go far beyond a single medical condition. If the fundamental concept of public healthcare planning fails here, it fails everywhere. Your public NHS funds are being drained by a 164 million pound overspend just to manage a diagnostic backlog, pulling critical resources away from emergency care.
And local budgets are breaking.
Exactly. Your local municipality is facing bankruptcy because of a rigid legal framework that demands expensive assessments the state can't provide. Even if you never interact with an ADHD clinic in your life, you are paying for this systemic failure.
Which is why the response needs to be structural. The core belief here is that knowledge must be applied. The ongoing NHS England Independent ADHD Task Force, which has been releasing reports throughout 2025, has finally put systemic reform on the table.
Right, they're looking at actual changes.
They are analyzing profit caps on NHS contracted services, tighter auditing of private equity providers, and a shift toward a whole system approach. But capping profits is just managing the symptoms of the crisis.
Yeah, managing symptoms is different from breaking the cycle.
Exactly. Until policymakers address the underlying mechanics like uncoupling basic educational support from a formal medical diagnosis, we are just moving deck chairs on a sinking ship. Thousands of genuine patients are currently paying the price for a bureaucracy that refused to look at its own roadmap.
It is an infuriating reality. We had the timetables, we watched the water rise against the dam for almost a decade, and we did absolutely nothing to change the flow, which leaves me with one final kind of chilling concept for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
If the data for this multi-billion-pound crisis was flashing red on open public government dashboards as early as 2016 and nobody stopped it, what other catastrophic healthcare or social crises are currently sitting right there in today's open data, completely ignored, just waiting for their own decade-long fuse to run out?